Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootleggers, shills, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, jihadis, Sunnis, Shiites. I'm a useful idiot, and today I would like to talk about the fact that Iran is not our enemy. This is much the way I feel about Syria, and I say that Iran is not our enemy, and that this impending war should not happen. And as usual, I want to present a broader scope of things, a bigger picture, panorama, and put this into a big picture and a context. Because I think a lot of Americans don't really know that much about Iran, and it's quite an enigma, and there's a lot of distortions. My perception is that Iran is a very middle-class country with a lot of the same qualities of life that we like here in the United States. And they dress differently, they like different food, they listen to different music, they have a different form of government. And other than that, I don't find that much different. And I also think that a lot of the things that happen in their society and Islamic society in general are fairly exaggerated. We hear about homosexuals being lynched in the streets. We hear about women being stoned for adultery and all these examples, but I don't condone that sort of activity, and any state sponsorship of that kind of activity, or even religion that condones that kind of activity in the Islamic world. I'm not going to judge. It doesn't appeal to me, and I find it abhorrent and revolting and primitive. But I don't want to judge that culture based on those things, because one could easily take things out of context about American culture too. They could concentrate on stories about racist crimes where blacks are towed behind a truck with a chain, or there's crimes against gays in this country, and those sort of behaviors, and they could blow out of proportion how much that dominates in American society too. That's just my feeling. Very easy to misunderstand what is actually going on in that country without actually being there. And for that reason, actually, I attached some pretty interesting videos below and some information. One, of course, is the famous tourist TV show host, Rick Steves, going to Iran and showing a country that would very much surprise you. And so now I'm going to get into some facts that will probably surprise you further about Iran. They are the 25th largest economy in the world. They are the 18th largest country in the world, about the size of Alaska. They have a population of 80 million people, and they have the second largest provable natural gas reserves in the world, and also the fourth largest proven petroleum reserves. So there's a quick, easy answer as to why the Western world is interested in Iran, other than the fact that all rogue regimes, or all rebellious regimes, or all regimes that aren't part of the network that is being set up will be eliminated, and Iran is one of them. But it just so happens that they have the second largest provable natural gas reserves in the world and the fourth largest proven petroleum reserves in the world. So, and let's go through a little bit of their history. They were actually conquered by the Muslims in 651 AD, and then they were Persia for most of their existence, and a lot of people still refer to Iran as Persia. And in 1906, they became a constitutional monarchy, and by 1941, they actually got invaded by Britain and the USSR, because they had a lot of ties to Germany. So, interesting footnote that they would get invaded by Britain and USSR during World War II. So by 1951, a progressive democratic leader was elected in Iran after their prime minister was assassinated. And the new guy's name was Mossadegh. And he was such a progressive figure and so admired around the world. He's actually on the cover of Time magazine as Man of the Year for 1952. And, but he did a bad thing. He nationalized the petroleum industry and petroleum reserves in Iran. Something you don't do to the United States, something you don't do to Britain, something you don't do to oil companies. So, of course, Britain immediately boycotted Iran and blockaded their ports, much like the same tactics we're seeing today. So this is nothing new, and there isn't that much new. And of course, speaking of things that aren't new, by 1953, Mossadegh was toppled by the British in the UK in a coup d'etat, and that's when the Shah, an authoritarian monarch, was set up in Iran by the United States and Britain in 1953. And, this is another example of something that America's done over and over again around the world, and toppling these duly elected governments because we don't like the results. And as a matter of fact, Iran was the first time that the U.S. had openly overthrown an elected civilian government. So a pretext was set up, and we took Mossadegh down. In 1953, Eisenhower set up Project Ajax, and Mossadegh was removed from power in 1953, and the Shah was put into power. So if you look at this trajectory, we have 1953, the Shah is put in power, and 26 years later, we have the Islamic Revolution, where the people of Iran toppled a government that was led by a despot propped up by the British and the U.S., and he was put in power by a coup. So I think Americans have to face the fact that there's a lot of reason for Iran to resent the United States and resent the Western world for our meddling in their country. And oddly enough, all the other countries in the world now have a relationship with Iran, except for the United States and Israel, because we like to hold a grudge. And that's what we do. And, of course, the most famous incident that people know about Iran is that when they took over in the Islamic Revolution in 1979, a lot of Americans were taken hostage, and they were held for 2 years, from 1979 to 1981. But the thing to remember here that's important is that these hostages were taken, and we had a policy of not negotiating with terrorists. And Jimmy Carter, of course, made some attempts to get the hostages released. They didn't prove to be successful. The interesting footnote, of course, is that the Ronald Reagan campaign got involved in negotiations and set it up so that the famous Iran-Contra, so Reagan set up to sell guns to the Iranians. And incidentally, the hostages in Iran were released the day that Reagan was sworn in as President of the United States. So he wanted to make sure that the hostages weren't released before the election so that Jimmy Carter wouldn't win. So an interesting footnote. But that said, another thing interesting that happened at this time, of course, was that we supported both sides of a war. So we had also toppled the government of Iraq before this and propped up Saddam Hussein. So by 1980, and the Islamic Revolution was in full swing in Iran, Saddam Hussein took advantage of this and started a war with Iran that lasted for 10 years. And it was a horrible war. And let's have a moment here to think of what Iran went through. They lost over 1 million men in this war, including 60 to 70,000 killed with the use of chemical weapons. And I would note that in spite of the fact that Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on Iran, they did not retaliate with chemical weapons, which says something about the character of Iran, like it or not. So Saddam Hussein went to war. We armed both sides and encouraged both sides, and that's how we do it, and made sure everybody had plenty of weapons. So then after the Iraq-Iran war, then in Iran, going back to Iran, in 2005 we have Amadenijad elected as president. And a lot of people don't realize that he is not actually the leading decision maker in Iran. It is the supreme leader. And I was kind of fascinated when I went in and looked at the form of government, how their government works from top to bottom, and they have a very progressive government, actually, with a lot of checks and balances and a lot of democracy. In some areas of their government election systems, they're even more democratic than the United States. And incidentally, the supreme leader can even be deposed through consensus. So it's not quite as totalitarian as one might suspect, although they certainly have a secret police state and a lot of controls in their country. And so not unlike a lot of countries in the world today, including the United States, I would add. So, and let's now talk about the fact that Iran has these nuclear ambitions, because that's where we are today. And my feelings on this are going a couple different directions. One direction is the fact that why shouldn't they have a bomb? They have legitimate needs, so even if they build a bomb, I mean, really, what's going to happen? They're certainly not going to go up against the United States. I don't think they're going to supply nuclear materials to terrorists, even though they support Hamas and Hezbollah, because if any terrorist group used nuclear weapons, Israel would retaliate against Iran, even if they couldn't prove they were involved. And frankly, it's a lot easier to get nuclear weapons from Pakistan. If terrorists wanted to get nuclear weapons, it would be very easy to get them from Pakistan. The checks and balances and securities there are not quite what they are in Iran, I assure you. So I just don't see that happening. And that's another part of the quotient. Israel has 200 to 300 armed nuclear warheads. So realistically, what would Iran do if they developed a weapon or two? They would still be obliterated by Israel. And the other thing is that, frankly, there hasn't been any proof that they are developing this program for anything other than energy needs. And their energy needs are legitimate. They've invested in a lot of progressive energy programs, including wind power plants, geothermal plants, and solar thermal plants. So they have a wide array of energy generating systems, and nuclear is just part of that. And their demographic trends and industrialization require that they get a lot more power. Their electric power demand is going up 8% a year. 8% a year is a lot, so they need to generate a lot of power. And they're a very self-contained country, and I think they have a legitimate need to generate this power. And even if they are developing a weapons program, who cares? I don't think these weapons are going to fall in the hands of terrorists. I don't think Iran would use them. It's just a political toy, and that's what nuclear bombs have been used for since World War II, and they would be no exception. And I think that, if you look at their culture a little more close too, it's like I feel really badly that we're considering this attack, and that a lot of Americans have this misconception about Iran. And they have the highest urban growth rate in the world. So we have, and their population, 2/3 of their population is under 25, and they have a literacy rate of 82%. So they have a very young, very educated, very urban society in Iran. And sooner or later, they will change things in Iran. They tried to already. Very stirring demonstrations a few years back. After the Amadenijad re-election in 2009, it was great to see all those people in the streets. An unarmed revolution that almost was. And I think that the fact that they haven't invaded any other countries, they haven't participated in the Israeli wars throughout the 20th century, and actually they spend the lowest amount of money on the military in the entire region. Only 2.6% of their GDP goes to military spending in that region. So not a very warlike country, I would say. And interestingly enough, too, they're self-contained military industry. So they build all their own weapons, with a few exceptions. So this idea that they're armed by China and Russia, they're helped with technology, but for the most part, they develop all their own military, which keeps them out of the international arms loop, which is probably another reason why they want regime change. They probably love to get Iran in a position where they had to buy from the global military-industrial complex. So, so anyway, other than that, it's a beautiful country. It's very mountainous. In the northern Iran, they actually have rainforests. I know a lot of people don't imagine the vast jungle forests in northern Iran. In fact, the country was populated with lions and tigers up until the 20th century. So, very interesting country, and some of the links that I will provide will show that they are a very interesting culture and not that far removed from what quality of life we like to pursue here in the United States. And I would also add, too, that I think a lot of people forget that when 9/11 happened, Iran was pretty accommodating, which was very surprising to me. So let's not forget that in some small way they appreciated the tragedy of 9/11 and were very hospitable in those moments. So, so anyway, that's my bit about Iran. I don't think they are our enemy. I don't think Syria is our enemy. But coincidentally, both Iran and Syria are the last two countries on a list that Wesley Clark talks about from 1995. So there was a list in 1995 that listed 7 Middle Eastern regimes that all were going to be toppled in regime change. And all the countries have: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. And now we have Iraq, and now we have Syria and Iran, the last two in the sights. Hardly a coincidence. So, and another part of this quotient too is all this talk about provocations. There's so much criticism going to Iran about how provocative they've been. But let's see who's been provocative when you have Israeli Mossad agents inside the country assassinating their scientists and blowing up depots and other installations. Who's provocative when they send viruses into computer systems that run that country's grid and communications and nuclear industries, for which they generate power as well? Who is provocative when they send black ops there? The U.S. has black ops working, special forces working in Iran at this moment, doing the same thing that Mossad is doing, basically wreaking havoc and doing intelligence for any upcoming military action. And I pray to God that we don't. Who knows what the results are going to be? Personally, I don't really think that Russia and China would get directly involved. That's just my opinion. But nonetheless, it's a tragic situation. I would really hate to see it. It's a beautiful country. We have no bone to pick with them. They're not doing anything wrong, and they are not our enemy. Iran is not our enemy. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.